Decisions and future. We take decisions to determine the future. We want to get the world into a certain state as the outcome of our decisions. And today we're discussing how do we do that. And my point is complementary to those of other speakers. I'm asking for us, what's the role of us, of human people, of our individual and our inter-individual skills and competences when taking decisions to build a common future? What is the role of trust? Well, let's start first by looking at what the world is like. Whatever the world may be physically, consider it a space of flows of energy and matter. It's for sure a continuum. This here is a flow of energy and matter, but of course we do not process it that way. We see it as objects, as houses, as animals, as roads, as trees. Thus what we are doing is we introduce sense, we introduce structure to describe the continuum, the physical continuum of the world. And my main point is that that structure needs to be sufficiently complex to match the continuum we are using and which is relevant to us. And I'm fully convinced that this complexity is rising. The complexity of the way the world is to us is rising each day. Why? Let's look at this piece of modern art. You can see it here in Karlsruhe. It's amazing. You see black immersion silicone oil dropping from the ceiling and falling into a tub. And you see that the tub looks perfectly like glass. It looks rigid, but in fact it's solid. It's impressive, but my main point here is that's complicated to do. You have to control gravity and viscosity and temperature. But the artist can do it. And this is what I'm trying to stress. We are able to control the physical continuum of the world each day more strongly. But while we're able to use it, we're never able to alter it. We can use gravity, but we cannot change what gravity is. And since we cannot change, we cannot simplify. And since we cannot simplify, our mental structure must become more complex, which is why the complexity of our world is rising. And the second point is crucial. Not only our ability to control the physical continuum is rising, but also our desire to do so. We have increasing necessity for such pieces of art, for new energy, for new materials. And we want to acquire that continuum, which we can use but cannot change. And remember, we also are part of the continuum. Our brain has a biophysical dimension, which we can use but cannot change. And it's not only that complexity is rising, it's also the consequences of our action. Karl Bühler has put us into a center which he called here, now, and I origin. I am here now. And what happens? That I, as I said, is getting more influential. We can control a larger part of the physical continuum each day. Just think about your mobile phones. And space and time are dissolving. Space is dissolving due to globalization, due to virtuality. And time also, the garbage I produce, isn't rotten in 2 years. It isn't rotten in 200 years. It lasts here for a long time, which means that I am in the center, increasingly influential, and I affect more people with my actions, and vice versa. I'm affected by the actions of more people as well, which still hasn't brought me back to trust. Which we have, on the one hand, complexity increasing, and on the other hand, consequences increasing. And that leads us right back to the two fundamental questions of philosophy. The first one being the question of theoretical philosophy, what can we know? And I argue that we can know each day less. You will say, but there's libraries, there's the internet. Yes, that's true. What's the percentage of the books published, the scientific books published each year that you can read? It's decreasing, it's getting marginal. Which means that when you decide your possibilities to fully understand the complexity of the decision problem at hand are decreasing, while at the same time, the fundamental question of practical philosophy being how should we act, what are we allowed to do, or put differently, what are we responsible for, is getting more is bigger. It's getting bigger each day. The facts we are responsible for, the breakfast you had this morning, for sure impacted to the lives of people on 3 different continents at least. That's the complexity consequence problem. I individually can know less, while I have stronger impact onto the world. And here I am taking decisions, and when we take decisions, we are in a dilemma. And what does this dilemma look like? It again begins with the continuum, the physical dimension of time for whatever it is physically. It opens an horizon of possible states. This room here can be in a myriad of states depending on the decision of all of us. And we have to structure that complexity by introducing our here, now, and I origin, which structures into a past which is determined with known outcome, into a future which is contingent and undetermined. And here we structure the complexity of the horizon of possibilities into a couple of options. And then we select an option, and here begins the dilemma. When we pick an option, we try to determine what the world will be like. But much more strongly, we determine what it will not be like. Because while we cannot be sure about the outcome of option C, but we'll surely have lost the states the world would have taken in option A or B. And time continues. And of course, that horizon of possible states opens again. And maybe we see that we've been wrong, but should have taken another option. While we can change our minds, we can never get back to the state the world had when we decided. Which brings us into a particular dilemma when we're being evaluated. And we're being evaluated in post-modernity more strongly each day. Somebody always comes and asks us, what did you do? What is the output of your decisions? What came out of it? And he observes the trajectory of our decisions, each associated with alternatives, differently than we do. He observes it as the past, as defined, as already known, while we had to judge it as an option, as possible, contingent. And that creates, I'm convinced, a social phenomenon which I'd like to call the cult of the figures, which is basically overemphasizing the meaning of numbers and figures usually produced by computers, not so much by experts, but at least in public. And why is that happening? Because when we decide, we feel the problem with responsibility, and we try to get rid of that responsibility. We rank an Excel table with applicants, and we say, I picked the topmost row. Because at some moment when somebody comes and says, why did you contract that guy? He's bad. Then we can say, no, it wasn't me who decided. It was the maths. I only did the maths. And the same is true for the evaluator of our decision. He each day asks us more strongly for indices, quotients, ratings, thresholds, which is okay as long as they perform better. And we've been hearing that in many cases they do. And I'd like to stress that there are other cases where they don't. Why is that? What do we need to do when we decide? First of all, we need to define a potential basis of relevance. What is that? That is a bunch of data that could, at least theoretically, be relevant to the problem. It can then be subsetted into what is actually relevant. The first step already can be taken by computers. Then we have to identify an option, identify the need to decide, say, here we need a decision. We identify options, we select an option, and we execute that option. And then we need to act responsibly. And highlighted in red are the points where I feel that frequently computers cannot solely help us, or figures cannot solely help us, because in the first place, they cannot set up the potential relevance spaces, the actual C. Yes, but the potential, possibly not. They need a human operator. And of course, they can't act responsibly, to me at least. They're not subject to ethics. They're not subject to law. So somebody has to take the decision, and somebody needs to define how to get through the process from the beginning to the end. And that has consequences, because that escape to the figure is never totally possible. We can never get ourselves out completely. And the consequences are that in certain situations, it may be more appropriate to deliberate as human people. The first are historically new situations, qualitatively entirely new situations, in which we would have to set up a new relevance basis, which maybe we can, but which can take us more time than rationally deliberating. Situations in where normativity play a crucial role, because as I said, computers don't act ethically. And what about the entire steps in between that can be taken by computers, that can be judged on the basis of figures? Well, here computers entirely outperform you when analyzing the structure of the data. And it's not true that human minds generalize better. In some cases, computers do generalize better. But when it comes to judging on the meaning of the data, then computers and figures do not perform that well, because the meaning may change, especially in situations where things are not only political, but have a different meaning in economy and science. Then we get into problems when taking decisions on the basis of numbers and figures. And the last point is human conduct. Yes, we can predict human conduct with computer, but not in each case. Humans act utilitarian, act rationalist, but they also act on value, on emotion. And they try to maintain their identity. How this person maintains his identity is relevant to the political future to all of us. But how can we automatically make a prognosis on that? Which leads me back to the alternative. What's the alternative when you have a complexity problem that you cannot reduce exclusively on the basis of figures? Well, there's trust. As Luhmann argued, if the world is too complex for you, then have some part of the complexity be processed by somebody else whom you trust. But which kind of trust? What kind of trust is rational in postmodernist decision-making? There are at least 3 types, and only one is. The first is dysfunctional. It is submissive. It relates to status. And it is claimed by authorities. Trust me because I'm a professor. Okay, I'll trust you because you're higher in the ranking. That's dysfunctional. We shouldn't judge this way. The second one is personalized trust. It's emotional, affectual, and related to identity or personality, and claimed by persons. Trust me because I'm your husband. Okay, I'll trust you because I love you. That has its intrinsic value, but since the value is intrinsic, it's autological and it's not rational. And it doesn't help us in postmodernist decision-making. And the third is informed trust. Informed trust is rational because it relates to skills and competences, and only to skills and competences, not to status, not to personality, not to identity. And thus, it is trust offered by people who have a complexity consequence problem and look for somebody who can help out. And that person needs to commit himself to the problem. And that means he gets into discourse with other people who have other opinions, and they try to deliberate, and they try to consider and find solutions, even when struggling, even in debate. That's informed trust, and that is what we need when figures don't help us. So you may say, well, that's straightforward. Well, then let's look what actually happens. We are currently in a situation which is highly complex, which is highly affected by consequences, and which matches several of the criteria where I said that figures don't help. It's normative, it's relatively new, and its meaning changes in the different spheres. So here is where we need consideration and debate by people which are at least backed up by a general trust so they can decide. But what is actually happening? We see the birth of so-called political alternatives roaming the European Parliament just as this bird does. And what do they tell you? Well, they tell you about the complexity, that it simply isn't there. The situation is easy. We only have to switch off the magnet to keep people from coming. Assume we were under a nuclear attack by North Korea. An equivalent answer, what would it be? No, we only have to switch off the lights to keep Kim Jong-il from hitting us? And that's not what is helpful in postmodern problems. And what happened with the people who instead tried to gain trust? They were mistrusted. They were affected by aggression, by hatred. Policy is incompetent. Science is corrupt and media are liars. That's not what helps us out of the problem, because the world is complex and actions have consequences. And we cannot reduce them by mistrust. We can only reduce them by decision. That's, so to speak, not finding the solution. It's merely institutionalizing the core of the problem. What was in the core of their argument? They too were practicing the cult of the figures. They claimed that it could all be solved by a threshold, an upper limit, a number, saying, okay, we limit it to 200,000 migrants. They told you nothing about complexity. What did you do to reduce complexity to get to that number? They didn't tell you anything about consequences. What were the consequences for the first 200,000? They only told you some strange and inhumane consequences for the 200,000 and first. Which leads me to the conclusion of my talk. What is our common future and what role plays trust? As I've said, I see a risk that we enter a cult to the figure, overemphasizing figures, compressing the complexity of our lives, of phenomena into numbers. Numbers which may not be helpful. Numbers which may not be significant. And we're entering an age of distrust in which we feel rational by distrusting, in which we feel modern by distrusting, and in which we feel only rational by trusting figures and not trusting people. Because numbers are obviously so highly appealing to persons. And if that happens, then we'd have a problem with societal coherence, having on the one hand institutions that cannot decide because they're no longer legitimated, and on the other hand, having a public left alone with that complexity consequence problem. And that's not the future we are trying to have. So I said to you, in certain situations, we need a certain kind of trust. And I really hope that we'll all see happening a renaissance of trust.